To the scriptures, to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 11, verses 27 to 33. They, Jesus and the disciples, arrived again in Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them?" And Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me." And they argued with one another. "What should we say? If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But shall we say of human origin?" They were afraid of the crowd, for all regarded John as truly a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." We continue our sermon series on living a flourishing life. And this morning our title of our sermon is "We Don't Know," and it comes from that scripture passage. Now, in his book, Playing God, Redeeming the Gift of Power, Andy Crouch shares the story of flying on Saudi Arabian Airlines from Mumbai, India to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and then onward to London. He arrived at the Mumbai airport to find a long line, perhaps 75 people waiting to check in. Nearly everyone an Indian man with a small suitcase, manual laborers being imported to Saudi Arabia as guest workers. Andy was at the back of the line. But he had been there less than 5 minutes when the agent came out from behind the counter, walked down the line, came to Andy's spot, and he said, "Come with me." Andy writes, "When you're several thousand miles from home and an airline agent says that, you obey." He followed him to the front of the line, past all 75 men, and without another word, the agent took his passport, examined it, printed out the boarding pass, handed it to him, and said, "You may go." And until the agent said, "You may go," Andy did not understand what was happening. When he realized it, he was shocked and embarrassed. He had been singled out and ordered to cut in line, and no one seemed to think anything of it. As he walked to the gate, it dawned on him that they had understood what was happening long before he did. He says, "They knew something I was only beginning to understand, the power of privilege." Have you ever had an experience in your life when you realized you had been shown favoritism because of your age, your ethnicity, your gender, maybe because of relationships, someone you knew, or because of your citizenship? Andy Crouch's story of privilege reminds me of a similar experience in my life. I didn't get to cut in line. Rather, I had to wait until I was last in line to see the judge. I was 17, a junior in high school, and been clocked going 78 miles an hour in a 55-mile-an-hour zone. When the officer approached my car, he questioned me. "You weren't wearing your seatbelt, were you?" Being the first time I was pulled over, I was nervous. When I saw the lights in my rearview mirror, I had put my seatbelt on. But I was nervous, so I admitted I wasn't wearing it. So the officer did his thing, gave me my citations, and because I was a juvenile, I had to appear in court to settle my tickets. Now, after the courtroom had emptied out of everyone else, the judge called me forward. "David, did you learn your lesson? Are you a good student?" And then he said to me, "Well, the fine for not wearing your seatbelt is mandatory, as is the driver safety course you are required to attend. But so-and-so said you're a good kid, a good student, so I'm going to dismiss the fine for your speeding ticket. You only have to pay the court costs." Well, I was quite pleased and happy about this, and I relished sharing the story with my classmates of getting out of that larger fine. Until a classmate confronted me and said, "You know, my father could get in trouble for doing that." I hadn't even thought about it, how his father had put in a good word for me, and how my relationship with him gave me privileged standing in front of the judge. This morning we're going to talk about privilege. We'll define privilege, we'll explore its benefits, its neutrality, and lastly, its danger to living a flourishing life. We're going to see an example of the religious leaders in Mark's gospel exercising their privilege. And we'll consider some practical steps to walk out of privilege to true flourishing for ourselves and others. Now, privilege is a special kind of power. It is a form of power that requires no effort. And indeed, only in unusual circumstances, such as the Mumbai airport, do we become conscious of it at all. Most time, it just works on behalf of those who have it, and it doesn't make any demands. And no matter who we are, we all have some form of privilege. Some have more than others. Andy Crouch writes, it's almost impossible to know how much privilege one has. He provides the example in his book of never having spoken to a security guard at a shopping mall or store. But most of his friends of African descent, including those with Ivy League degrees and occupations of higher status than his own, have been followed or confronted by retail security personnel. And had his friends not shared their stories with him, he never would have believed that such things happened to them. And so Crouch defines privilege as the ongoing benefits of past successful exercises of power. Right? Privilege is the name for all the good things we do not need to try to acquire, because they simply flow to us because of past exercises of power, whether our own or someone else's. Now, it's important for us to understand that privilege itself is not bad. It's neutral. It simply comes to us in the form of benefits. It's not necessarily exclusive, and it can be widely shared. We all benefit from countless past exercises of individual and cultural power. For example, indoor plumbing. We all benefit from indoor plumbing. And modern sewer system, probably the greatest thing to reduce mortality. We are privileged to live after the invention of the Gutenberg press, so that literacy became important to everyone. We're privileged to live in a country that provides religious freedom, that our Baptist forebears argued for, one of whom was imprisoned by King James in England. We all benefit from this person who first ate that what was thought a poisonous tomato. We all benefit from that. We benefit from the discovery of scientists and explorers. Every single person benefits from past exercises of power, whether they're parents or other distant ancestors. Isaac Newton once said, "If I have seen further, it is only by standing on the shoulder of giants." Think about that. If I have seen further, it's only by standing on the shoulder of giants. Now let's pause for a moment and think about different examples of privilege in our lives. Here's one. We all speak English. That means we can travel fairly widely throughout the world if we're able to, without ever really having to learn another language. Here's another one we share. I make up that we all live in a safe and secure environment, most of us here, that none of us here this morning worry too much about our physical safety from outside of our homes. Now, I said it this way because I know it's probable that there could be someone here who doesn't feel safe in his or her own house. But I make up that most of us probably feel safe from threats that would come outside of our house. Here's another privilege: good schools in our community. Or that we were born or have immigrated to one of the richest countries in the world with the largest economy. Here's a quote: "If you have food in your fridge, clothes on your body, a roof over your head, and a place to sleep, you're richer than 75% of the entire world. If you have money in your wallet, can go anywhere you want, you're among 18% of the world's most wealthy people." Right? If we're alive and healthy. These are all blessings, all privileges. Now, at the same time, some of us have received inheritances in our lives, and that's also a form of privilege. And think about how that works. Someone flourished in their life. They created an abundance beyond what was needed for their own life, and the heir received the ongoing benefits of that abundance with having to work for it. And so benefits come to us. They're neutral. However, some of the benefits we experience are due to someone's image bearing, someone being an icon and flourishing. But other times, benefits we experience have been the result of exercises in idolatry, control, or exploitation. And so we have benefited from both good exercises of power in the past and those that were regrettable or worse, whether our individual ancestors or collectively as a people. So we've defined privilege, we've defined its benefits, we've explored its benefits and its neutrality, which means we're left to explore its danger. The first danger of privilege is to be unaware of it. For example, Andy crouched at the Mumbai airport, or myself in front of the judge. Or as Pastor Gregory James Edwards said at Building a Community of Power on Friday, privilege is waking up on third base and thinking that you've hit a triple. The second danger is that we can use our benefits of privilege for purposes other than promoting flourishing of oneself and others. To flourish requires risk-taking. Any baseball fans here? A few baseball fans, right? Pastor Edwards said on Friday, I like this one, one can't steal second base with one's foot stuck on first. So to flourish requires risk. It requires dependence on God and other people. And if we're not careful, we can use our privilege to insulate ourselves from risk, from God, and from others. And that's the danger found in our scripture this morning. The chief priests and elders came to Jesus and said, "What authority are you doing these things?" And by these things, they referred to what he had done just previously, which was he had cleansed the temple. Some say he cursed the temple. Right? And it stopped. Some say he stopped the sacrificial system that was set up in the temple. He's concerned that they've set up a system that benefits those who are more privileged. He said to them, what? My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. So in response to their question, Jesus said to them, I will ask you a question. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Was it divine, or was it from humans? Jesus' question to the religious leaders is an opportunity for them to repent. It's an opportunity to join with John and Jesus with the new thing that God is doing. But we hear, because of their fear of embarrassment, that they would have to acknowledge that they were wrong about John, or their fear of the people who thought John was a prophet, because of those fears, they don't answer. They don't take any meaningful action in response to Jesus' question. They don't want to risk the vulnerability for fear of the people. And so because of their position, their status, because of their privilege, they withdraw. We don't know. And they leave. They withdraw. See, this is the threat posed by the power of privilege. It gives us the luxury of choosing withdrawal, of choosing safety. Someone once said, the only thing money can buy is bubble wrap. But when we choose withdrawal, when we choose privilege, when we choose safety, what happens? What happens is that others miss out on opportunities to flourish. You see, those with privilege can afford to not pay attention. To quote Pastor Edwards one more time, he said on Friday, to say I'm not into politics is a statement of privilege. Only the privileged can opt out. Although he also pointed out that if you try driving 90 miles per hour down the road and there's a police officer, you'll discover that you can't opt out of politics. We can be like the religious leaders and simply say, we don't know. I hear no evil. I see no evil. I speak no evil. If you think back to May of 2020, that's what made George Floyd's murder so alarming, so powerful. but also so terrible is that we couldn't look away. We couldn't not see it. Recall our sermon series thus far. We said we were created to flourish, to be fruitful, to multiply, to have stewardship over the earth, and that requires both authority and vulnerability, strength and weakness, risk and power, power and risk. We want to live up and to the right. But the reality of our lives is that we all spend time in quadrant 2, the quadrant of suffering, where we have great vulnerability and we have little authority. And then we have a choice to make. Will we create an idol, or will we be an icon and bear God's image to the world? Too often we choose up and to the left, to choose control and exploiting. We seek greater authority with less risk. And what ends up happening is idolatry that leads to injustice, that leads to suffering of others. Vulnerability shed by one group of people is inevitably borne by others' suffering. The pursuit of authority without vulnerability always comes at the price of causing others to live with vulnerability without authority. And that suffering is always greater than whatever momentary benefit came from the control and the exploiting. You can just think of any society that is living under a dictator. That is the most extreme form of this. That is the greatest form of this dynamic. And what usually happens when people grasp for a control and they exploit is that violence is done to those communities that are suffering. And what ends up happening is after so much time, there's reciprocal violence that flows back up to those in control or doing the exploiting. We might say, well, that's a violent neighborhood. Do we ever stop and think about the violence that's been done to or experienced by those in that community? So this is what takes place in our society, and here's where the threat of privilege comes in. Those who have the ability can withdraw. We can step back. What are the ways that we step back from exercising our power, our authority? What are ways that we seek to live with safety and withdraw without risk? Well, we might seek to live in a gated community. We might not watch the evening news. We might be an ostrich and put our head in the sand. We might say to our pastor, don't be political, right? Andy Crouch tells another powerful story in his book, Playing God. He begins by saying that for many Americans, September 11th, 2001 was a sudden plunge into the icy sea of risk and the terror of threats that had seemed safely remote. But his own life-changing encounter with urban terror came in New York's Penn Station a decade earlier, in an episode just as sinister in its own way as the attacks of 9/11. On May 1st, 1992, he arrived in Midtown Manhattan on a train from Boston on his way to a city-wide prayer meeting in the Bronx. But he stepped off his inbound train into a sea of chaos. 2 days before, the acquittal of 4 police officers and the beating of an African-American man named Rodney King had set off riots across Los Angeles. With helicopter footage from LA of burning neighborhoods and angry crowds airing constantly on live television, cities across the United States were tinderboxes of hostility and fear. In New York City, rumors of riots had spread across Manhattan at midday. Businesses were abruptly shutting down, sending their employees home and boarding up their street-level windows. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Penn Station was more crowded than it would normally be at the height of rush hour. And as Andy walked down the train platform, he watched in amazement as terrified white-collar workers tried to squeeze themselves into overloaded commuter trains, shoving and elbowing one another in barely restrained panic. As they ran toward a boarding train, he heard one say to another, "The blacks are coming over the bridges to burn Manhattan." Andy writes, "Need I mention that nearly everyone getting on the train was white?" Now, the rumors were entirely false, which is why few of you whom I'm telling this story to would have any knowledge of anything unusual that happened in Penn Station that long ago Friday afternoon. The rumors were also absurd. In LA that weekend and in nearly every other riot in American history, the neighborhoods most affected were the neighborhoods of the aggrieved rioters themselves, not privileged places that enjoy reliable policing. And the idea that the blacks, which is an incredibly offensive generalization, might somehow mount an assault on the shops and office towers of Midtown was laughable to say the least. And yet millions of commuters found it believable enough to flee the city as fast as the Long Island Railroad could carry them. Andy writes, "That afternoon it occurred to me that the placid calm of my own suburban upbringing had been as thin as the walnut veneer on a cheap TV stand. Just under the surface was a throbbing fear of vulnerability and risk, so raw and fierce that it could be stirred into panicked flight by the merest suggestion of a real threat. The idolatry of privilege lay quietly under the surface, unmapped, waiting for the slightest provocation to stir it into raging action." Andy's story reminds me of my own story of privileged panic. When I came face to face with my own idolatry of privilege. I know I've probably told this story before, but perhaps someone is new here this morning. And I'll tell it again because it's such a key moment in my spiritual life. I attended the celebration of the beloved community on Martin Luther King Day, only to encounter a preacher who dared to ask, "How far have we come? How far have we come?" I took offense to his question. I felt attacked. I wanted to withdraw, go back home to suburbia. I now know what I was experiencing in that moment. There's a name for it. It's called white fragility. So I was angry, and I returned to my uptown home in Harrisburg, a white student in a black neighborhood. And my friend and mentor asked us when we came in, "How was it?" And I gave him a gruff response. I was angry. My privilege had experienced the slightest provocation. But thanks be to God. Thanks be to God that my mentor Byron sat with me until 2:30 a.m. in the morning, and we talked it out and we talked it through. And from that, I will always take that my job, perhaps the job of my generation, is to listen to the stories of others, to listen to their stories of suffering, even when it comes across as anger. And I've learned to listen as long as I'm doing my internal and external work, as long as I'm taking steps away from withdrawal and into the path of flourishing. And here's the good news about moving out of this bottom quadrant to live a flourishing life. The good news is that any move towards authority or vulnerability, any move towards meaningful action or taking a risk will be a step in the right direction. Andy Crouch suggests that for those of us swallowed in affluence or intoxicated by technology, the move we might need to make is out into the natural world. The world of stars, snow, rain, trees, and deserts. Step into the natural world. Step into the relational world. With real bodies, with heartbeats, hands, and faces. If you're a college, a high school, or a middle school student, walk across your campus without looking at your screen or without earbuds in your ears. Make a commitment to introduce yourself to one person each day. Just learn their name and give them yours. Get to know your neighbor down the street. Perhaps you've lived next to them for 10 years, but you're still not sure who they are. Invite them over for coffee or tea, to sit out on your front porch or your back porch. Invite a friend out for coffee or tea, or an adult beverage, and ask them questions. Just one step riskier than the last time you talked. And as you listen, observe the flickers of sadness or hope that cross their face. Imagine what it might be like to live their story, to live their dreams, to dream their dreams, and to experience their losses. Here's another suggestion of stepping out of privilege. Become a pilgrim and not a tourist the next time you travel. This past summer, my family went to South Dakota and then up to English, Manitoba for our family reunion, and I faced this tension. When we decided to visit South Dakota and Mount Rushmore, when I looked on the map, I realized we were not far from the site of the Wounded Knee Massacre, that place where 300 Lakota Indians were massacred by the U.S. Army in 1890. I didn't become aware of that history until I was in college. And I didn't want my children to grow up with an unawareness of that historical reality. And so we looked into doing a tour with Native Americans of the Pine Ridge Reservation, including the site of the massacre, to listen to their stories, to listen to them tell their history. But it was cost prohibitive. Although, perhaps we could have chosen not to spend our money on the Sunrise Buffalo Safari. It was a tension. I mean, the Buffalo Safari was great. It was wonderful. It was pleasing. It was a tension, but we were pilgrims. We found a way to be pilgrims when we visited a museum run by Native Americans at one of the schools in one of the communities near the reservation. We were pilgrims when we read history books of the Lakota. So travel like a pilgrim. Seek to encounter people who have been sanctified by suffering. Accompany them for a short season and share what you have with them in sufficient measure. These are some of the external steps we can take to step out of the security of withdrawal, of not knowing. And the choice is ours. The Apostle Paul wrote in Galatians, "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. Because the whole law is summed up in a single commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The external needs to be accompanied by the internal journey, revealed in Andy's visit to New York in May of 1992. He was on a way to the prayer meeting in the Bronx, the first of a whole weekend of gatherings for prayer around the city that had been planned long before the riots. He got on the 7 train with his friend and host, Mac, a longtime servant of the church in New York City. In those days, gentrification had barely reached the Upper West Side. And on that afternoon, the whole city retreated beyond closed gates. On that afternoon, when the whole city retreated beyond closed gates, they were surely the only 2 white guys voluntarily taking a train to the Bronx. They arrived at a small Spanish-speaking Pentecostal church where the prayer meeting was to be held, and found it packed with representatives of every one of the Bronx nations and tongues. And what happened that night was one of the most extraordinary experiences of worship Andy says he ever expects to encounter this side of the New Jerusalem. An outpouring of intercession, of grief, of hope, and joy shook the rafters of the building. Hour after hour of praise and prayer, songs and shouting, dancing and weeping. In that building, apart from a few privileged guests, were the released, those without status, those who could not call 911 and expect the police to come, those with no enclaves of privilege to retreat in a time of trouble, but they were not intending to retreat. They called out for God to be protectors of their homes and neighborhoods, and they called out for the peace of the city. They praised the one who had made himself the friend of sinners and the servant of all. And after the service was over, they poured out into the empty streets, bearers of hope and joy in a frightened city. Can I get an amen? And that night on the 11 o'clock news, befuddled anchors talked to puzzled reporters on locations in places like the Bronx, searching over their satellite uplinks for something newsworthy. But the streets were quiet. There were no riots. There was no looting. Well, one reporter said to her news desk that night, all we can say tonight in New York is that people are praying. Andy concluded, there is a power loose in the world that those who grip their privilege and status will never know. The scribes and the Pharisees said, we don't know. What about you? Do you know?